So this discussion might seem like an academic one because obviously these ideas are dominant mainly in academia. And it's true that we shouldn't waste too much time on like reading, understanding, and exposing all the theories under the banner, like under the umbrella postmodernism. Most of it is actually, at least for me, impossible to understand, but also like doesn't want to be understood. It's consciously developed for a small academic circle, which fits actually to the pessimistic and cynistic ideas and like being out of touch. But in the last decades, they have increased broader influence as well, also outside academia. Most ideas of what we usually call like identity politics have their roots in postmodernism. And also, for example, when we hear things like Marxism is outdated, you can't generalize everything, we live in such a complex world, there is no homogeneous working class anymore, we have to differentiate, and so on. So for us, theory is nothing abstract, but stands in dialectical relation to reality, class struggle, and our political activity. So that's why we don't deal with these issues because of academic interest, but to draw conclusions for our day-to-day work. As ISA or CWI, we never published anything on a Marxist view on postmodernism, so we are very much at the beginning of this discussion. Postmodernism is already being challenged in different ways, for example, through some in the feminist movement. But elements, of course, still exist and have an impact because postmodernism didn't just dominate academia, but found its path through education, media, public debates, and so on, because it was and is still useful for the ruling class. And because it was and is so hegemonial, it often exists in broad consciousness as an underlying mood, not in a very conscious way. For example, when it comes to a general skepticism towards closed ideologies such as Marxism. So to start, what is postmodernism? And I think like the best definition I found is from Terry Eagleton, who wrote, I will just put it in the chat. Postmodernity is a style of thought which is suspicious of classical notions of truth, reason, identity, and objectivity, of the idea of universal progress or emancipation, of single frameworks, grand narratives, or ultimate grounds of explanation. So it's a collective term for various approaches that have in common, among other things, of course, the rejection of the truth claims of different political and philosophical ideas. And in conclusion, they often claim that it's impossible to understand the world as a whole. With postmodernism, real social struggles and contradictions increasingly receded into the background of analysis. More and more, the focus was on their appearance in so-called social discourses. So social classes, class domination, and for example, women's oppression and so on became products of discourses, were seen as products of discourses. And the idea that language, discourse, ideas shape reality. The working class was written off as a revolutionary subject. In general, the idea of a revolutionary subject in itself and the possibility of revolutionary social change was doubted. Sometimes without meaning to many such approaches entered ideologies dominated by neoliberalism, actually, which also denies class society and isolates the individual. So dominant ideological trends always reflect the objective situation, consciousness, and the state of class struggle. So the development of these ideas in the mid and late 20th century had a material basis. They didn't just come out of, discourse in a vacuum. The historical context of the 60s and 70s was the enthusiasm of revolutionary movements, and then the defeat of 1968 and the effect it had on left intellectuals, especially the disappointment during the massive student movement, general strike, etc. And then when the Communist Party and the CGT leaderships, instead of asking the question of power in France, break the movement and negotiated with the government. So there was this deep disappointment from the communist parties, which was first reflected in ultra-Maoism, actually, of some of these intellectuals. And Eagleton explained this with unable to break the structures of state power. Post-structuralism found it possible instead to subvert the structures of language. Nobody, at least, was likely to beat you over the head for doing so. So the student movement was flushed off the streets and driven underground into discourse. So in general, in that time, we saw defeats of revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s internationally. The economic crisis and its effects in 1973. Another element, of course, was the bourgeoisification of the social democracies and the role of the trade union bureaucracies. And since the 1980s, more and more defeats of the working class movement and left internationally, which had, of course, a huge impact on consciousness. And on an economical level, this was reflected in the offensive of neoliberalism, privatizations, attacks on welfare states, and so on, which came hand in hand with an ideological offensive by the ruling classes. So as you might know, in 1989, the neoliberal Francis Fukuyama formulated his theory of the end of the history. And it's funny because in 2018, there's this one famous interview with him where he had to say things like, okay, maybe what Marx was right in some points and socialism ought to come back. And there's this famous quote, of course, by Thatcher, which shows the connection between postmodern ideas and the impact of neoliberalism. I won't bring the whole quote, but basically, there is no such thing as society. So with the collapse of Stalinism, postmodern ideas gained new popularity, which means the ideas developed out of frustration of intellectuals with Stalinism before the 80s and 90s, but they developed real dynamic or real popularity through the collapse of Stalinism. When the working class movement and organizations were crushed internationally, when there was a vacuum of ideas and the feeling that capitalism had won and that there is no alternative. And in that context, postmodernism seemed to formulate a radical answer by a focus on individuals and kind of individual change. So when we look deeper into some of these ideas, they must always be seen as an ideology, as I said, developed by intellectuals in academia. There's this formulation by Vivek Chibber, who formulated some interesting critique on post-colonial studies. And he said, I'll put it in the chat. If you want to establish yourself as a radical in academia and you don't want any of the hits to your career that come with being a Marxist, the first thing you have to do is say something negative about Marxism. It established that even though you're on the left, you're not one of them, which is kind of like a good material explanation of the postmodern view on Marxism. So it's hard to discuss every single concept. So we have to try to sum up the similarities between all these ideas. What they all have in common is a separation of base and superstructure. And they focus very much on like superstructure, culture, discourse, ideas, and so on. And we need to see where this comes from, because, of course, the kind of Stalinist focus on the economic base was actually a real problem. For example, like weaknesses of the traditional left when it came to women's oppression and so on. We know that Marxism can analyze the roots of oppression, for example. It can explain how racism historically developed through colonialism, how women's oppression developed out of the first class societies and so on, while postmodernism is often limited to descriptions. So actually Marxism has the tools to analyze superstructure in a much more accurate way. We have to be very clear about that, and we'll come back to that later. This strong idea within postmodernism that there is no universal truth is striking. The idea is that we can only be sure of our own interpretation of events and that every discourse is valid. So when it comes to discourse, the postmodern view is that discourse, of course, like depends on power. And this might sound similar to the Marxist approach that the dominant ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class. But we have to look at the understanding of what is power actually. And when it comes to this question of power, Foucault's ideas are a key source for postmodernism. And Foucault explained that power is, quote, the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. Whatever that means. So he breaks with the notion that power is, for example, located within the state, and he focuses on what some describe as micropolitics of power. And that like power is something we see actually everywhere. And everything Foucault wrote about, you know, the prisons and hospitals, schools, and so on. Again, with that, Marxism actually offers us the tools to analyze all these things. But there's a fundamental difference when it comes to class analysis and what we see as the power of the ruling class. The postmodern view on power is still relevant today and quite popular. For example, when it comes to ideas like white privilege or slogans like, you know, white silence is violence and so on. There is this diffused view on what is power, and it seems like, as I said, it would exist everywhere, which contains the potential to blur class divisions. So it's no surprise that Foucault focused mainly on micro resistances and in reality, like in the end, individual change in your own life. And we know all these ideas, for example, when it comes today to the idea of safe spaces and so on. Foucault said about Marxism that Marx is perhaps not enough for the knowledge of this so enigmatic thing that is called power. One knows roughly who exploits, where the profit goes, between whom it wanders back and forth, where it is reinvested, but what about power? Well, this is exactly what we see as, you know, the source of power in society. So of course we should never seem like we would deny any like real oppression, etc., and the day-to-day experiences of it. We know very well the repressive character of schools, prisons, and so on, but we always have to explain their roots and where real power comes from. And you have to do that in order to be able to overcome it. When you see power as something vague, which exists everywhere, between every individual and so on, it's very difficult, for example, to recognize what interests the working class and its different layers have in common. So a material analysis of society and capitalism is absolutely necessary to understand driving forces behind the power, or like a better word would be divisions between individuals and within the working class. So the essential tool for us is a class approach to really understand the roots of power relations. So one concrete example of the impact of postmodernism and this view on power and discourse is the development of post-colonial studies, which used tools of postmodernism to explain colonialism, or to try to explain colonialism and post-colonialism. It's a very popular trend in academia. When, like, for example, when I went to university, all of the classes on this were overfilled, because there was this idea that finally, you know, the view of the oppressed and the colonized is being, like, is listened to, is being heard. So post-colonial theory presents itself as being not just anti-capitalist, but anti-imperialist and anti-colonial. So one goal, goal of post-colonial studies is to broaden curricula to include writers from the former colonies, which like sounds good at first. But they argue that the concepts of Western social theory are invalid outside of the West and Europe, and that any theory seeking to understand these spaces under a common global framework is doomed to be Eurocentric. So they often reject Marxism, for example, with the same argumentation. In Said's Orientalism, for example, a very, very popular source of that, the target is Western discourse as a whole, not only bourgeois ideology, which is totally absurd when you think about the Russian Revolution, Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, China, all the many different liberation movements in Latin America, the neo-colonial world, and so on, that orientated towards Marx. They have the approach that the East is different from the West in some deep, unchanging way. And when you think about that, this has obviously some conservative implications. For instance, when it comes to the rejection of any universal human values as a Western construct. And their analysis of colonialism is actually very idealistic. For example, Stuart Hall, a popular theorist, argued that the power of cultural discourse created and reinforced Western dominance of the non-Western world, and that the knowledge produced by such discourses became social practice, and that became reality. They say that colonial capitalism was completely different than capitalism in the West, and that Marxism cannot provide the tools to discuss that difference because it ignores cultural and historical diversity. But I mean, that's a very obvious thing, you know, to say that there are differences between colonized parts of the world and the West, but what's the point? So the concrete conclusion is always mainly the rejection of Marxism. Again, we see a focus on discourse, ideology, and culture, which is totally abstract, and obviously no material analysis of the hard facts of colonialism, the economic and political interests behind colonialism, neo-colonialism of the ruling classes. So this is contrary to Marxism, that treats material processes as primarily and explains the development of ideas and culture on that basis. So again, for example, the development of racism as a way for the ruling class to legitimate colonialism is a key point of analysis for us. So we have to be clear, of course, that capitalism, of course, produces difference different developments in different parts of the world. It's not linear, but complex. But differences in the development of capitalism in different regions of the world do not need different theories to be analyzed. It's still a global economy, and capitalism is a global system. Marxism does not require that all countries go through the same sequence of economic stages, because we know that Marxism isn't a doctrine, but it is a tool. This is something that is often misrepresented in academia. Marxism is always, portrayed as dogmatic. So another expression of postmodern influence is the development of gender studies, which are often seen as a revolutionary step in academia to implement women's and LGBTQI views. But in reality, most of the ideas are stuck in postmodernism. They focus on gender and sexuality in a very individualized way. They focus very much on language, like Judith Butler does in particular. There is this idea to deconstruct gender, whatever that means and however that is going to work within capitalism and its need to oppress women systematically and so on. This idea to deconstruct is often meant to do that through language, because they see reality and the construction of sex and gender as a result of speech acts and non-verbal communication. The term difference is key for gender studies, like in other postmodern theories as well, which points to the approach that we have to see everything as different than other things. So Butler, for example, criticized feminism that they rely on so-called foundations, so that the basis of feminism is biological women, which in her view leads to exclusions. Like this is one of her points, one of her criticisms about feminism. So she draws then the conclusion that we have to question the classic feminist categories, such as biological women. So again, the historical background of these studies and these ideas were a backlash of the women's movement, actually, and unsolved issues from second wave feminism. Today, we see the impact through the popularity, for example, of intersectional feminism.
10 minutes left, including translation.
So postmodern influence becomes crystal clear when it comes, for example, to the debates on prostitution, the focus on individuals, the rejection of generalized analysis, the neoliberal argumentation of freedom to choose, and the lack of perspectives for change. And these theories, like queer theory, for example, can be popular because other feminist traditions are, for example, recognized as trans-exclusive. So in some cases, the popularity of these ideas reflect blind spots of the working class movement in the past, which means for us that when socialist feminism and Marxist feminism is weak or not present enough, doesn't seek to play a leading role in struggles and so on, this lack of alternatives can open the door for all of these ideas, especially when movements go down for a period and class struggle is on a low scale. When we see elements of postmodern ideas, often the best answer to them is to explain the Marxist view of the world and our approach to change reality. For example, our analysis of oppression and how it is deeply connected to class society and capitalism. This is why, first and foremost, as ISA members, we have to educate ourselves in Marxism, historical materialism, and so on. Because the working class people and youth we want to reach out to can be influenced by postmodernism, but not in a developed way. And also we have to ask, where is the negative element of having a closed worldview? Actually, it is very helpful to see things in their relation, to draw general conclusions and so on, because it is helpful and necessary for real organizing and real struggle. And although postmodernism appears to be against any generalized ideology, this is in itself an ideology. So we know some elements of postmodern influence can be really challenging in social movements, for example. And that is where we have to be very self-conscious about our ideas. We are confronted with these ideas when it comes to who is allowed to speak, like only when you experience oppression, you can speak about it. This is, of course, connected to privilege theory. For example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, at least in Austria, it was a big issue for us because comrades, for example, were attacked by organizers because they were white and as white people shouting through a megaphone. And this is, of course, kind of a reflection of individualism within postmodernism and the focus on heterogeneous experiences of oppression. The focus on culture is very popular today, for example, in social media discourses on racism, colonialism, and so on. Often we see, actually, in reaction to oppression and racism, kind of a glorification of culture. We see it with the concept of cultural appropriation, which is, again, an expression of this weird understanding of power. A comrade recently told me that she was sitting in the park with some friends, and one of them started playing Latin American music, and there were some other people coming to them and saying, stop that because it's cultural appropriation. So, of course, that's a very absurd example but of the impact of postmodernism, but it shows how far it can go. We are often confronted with the rejection of ideology in general in different social movements, and this independence is often used as a weapon against Marxists. We saw it, for example, in the climate movement. Looking for a translator. So, like, when you think about Lenin's sentence, for example, that the Marxist doctrine is omnipotent because it is true, imagine what a huge trigger that is for many people still. I think I have to wait for Marcus, right? Yeah, I'm waiting for the Portuguese translation. Okay, so like in general, there's this mood of, things are complex, there's no one true ideology. And for us, the question is this changing now when it comes to a layer of radicalized youth? Because we see more openness towards socialist and Marxist ideas in new generations. We've discussed that. And the negative impacts of Stalinism, of the collapse of Stalinism, are not as omnipresent as they were before. We see that too come to an end. But still, the approach to focus on the individual and all the things I explained are very dominant. Of course, after decades of neoliberalism, we know these ideas won't disappear automatically, of course, but they will be challenged through real struggle, because they gained popularity in the context of low level of class struggle and extremely difficult situations for Marxists. When class consciousness was thrown back, which explains the focus on smaller frames like language and so on. And it's very clear that they don't offer any tools to fight back. On the contrary, actually the roots of postmodernism deny the possibility and the positive view on progress, revolution, and so on. Last sentence, sorry. So our battle against these ideas is not on the theoretical level primarily, but ideas are tested in practice and in struggle. And we know that Marxism gives us the tools to develop struggle, to unite the working class. So when it comes to real battles, and when we play a role as socialist people, will recognize this, and postmodern ideas will lose influence.